Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anne-Marie Butler. I'm the President of the Agricultural Science Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Leadership Insights webinar this morning. I'm here in Kilkenny. It's quite a frosty, cold morning, but good to see the fog gone, and hopefully you're all safe and well where you are. As you are aware, throughout the last number of months, ASA has continued to provide interesting topics and events to all of our members and non-members, and today is certainly no different. We're all very aware and we all have our own ideas of what leadership is and what good leaders are. But today provides us with a unique opportunity to meet firsthand somebody who has actively demonstrated and lived the key attributes of good leadership. I'm delighted this morning to be able to welcome John Moloney, who will address us and chat with us in relation to his key insights from leadership. I was fortunate a couple of years ago to attend an event in Dublin when Sean Farrell was president of ASA, and John was the key speaker in relation to leadership. I must say many of the things that John shared that day still carry with me in both my career and personal capacity. And I thank John for that day. It must be over 5, 6, 7 years ago, John, but as I said, it still carries with me. John needs no introduction to people, but just a quick synopsis of many of his achievements to date. John graduated with his BAg degree back in 1978 and later an MBA in 1988. John spent much of his early career employed in the meat industry in the Department of Agriculture and Food. John joined Waterford Co-op in 1987 and progressed to CEO of the Agribusiness Division in 1995. He was appointed CEO of Food Ingredients with Glanbia plc in 1998 and served as Group Managing Director of Glanbia plc from 2001 to 2013. John is still very busy and is currently Chairman of the FTSE 100 listed DCC plc. He's Non-Executive Director of Smurfit Kappa Group and also Chairman Designate Director of ABP Food Group. I'm delighted this morning that Eoin Lowry was available to facilitate this session and will chat with John across the next 40 minutes. Eoin joined Bank of Ireland in 2020 as the Head of Agriculture to support the bank's group strategy in the country's largest indigenous sector. Eoin has held a number of senior commercial positions in the agri sector, including Managing Director of a leading fertiliser importer and manufacturer. Eoin was also Agribusiness Editor with the Irish Farmers Journal. Eoin holds a degree and master's degree in agriculture from UCD and an MBA from Smurfit School of Business. And of course, most importantly, Eoin is past president of the ASA. Across the session this morning, you can post your questions on the Q&A function. So please post your questions and Eoin will work through the questions. I encourage everyone to perhaps sit back and relax and enjoy the session for the next 40 minutes. And again, thank you to John and Eoin.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Okay. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. And I'm delighted to be taking part in this leadership series. I think it's an excellent initiative by the ASA, and I think it'll be very insightful and useful for ASA members. I've known John, I suppose, for a number of years as well. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to chat to John for about 45 minutes and mix in some of the questions from the floor throughout that. So if you use the function on your screens just to input your questions throughout the conversation, that'd be great. And I hope to get to most of those. Look, John has extensive management and board level experience. You know, as Anne-Marie has outlined, he's no stranger to transformation. And I hope that we can draw out some of the facts and the details around his career to date. Not only has he diversified, disposed, rationalized, reversed, migrated, restructured companies, he's also built and developed great companies throughout his career. So, John, very good morning to you, and it's really great to have you here on this call today with us.
Thanks, Eoin.
Just before we get started, right, I'd like to put up a poll. So if you can roll that there, Barbara, please, much appreciated. So you'll see a poll on your screens come up now in a minute, and if you could just answer yes or no to the question, are leaders born or made? So we just give that a couple of seconds there, just if you can all input your answer. And then we can just see. Okay, that's great. Now, Barbara, I don't know if we have any answers on it, or can we see the results? Okay, great. So that's brilliant. 35% of you, so just over a third of you, believe that leaders are born. And 65% of you believe that they're not, that they're made. So, John, do you agree with this, or what's your views on whether a leader can be born or made?
Well, I suppose in deference to my genealogy and family history, I might like to think they were born, but that's not the case. I think if you get they develop. I think some people develop faster than others, and I think that's maybe what people see as a difference. And then there are often very unique individuals that come along that are strikingly stand out at a relatively young age. But if people can't be developed, then it throws an awful lot of academic research and textbooks and practice in businesses today in the bin. So I believe it's a combination of a lot of things, but certainly people can be developed. People develop over time. If we don't believe that, then we ignore the capacity for human potential and development.
That's definitely encouraging to hear anyway, that, you know, it's not a birthright, it's more that something can be developed. We might just throw up the second poll there as well. We're going to do 2 questions throughout this conversation. So Barbara, if you could just roll the second poll, and it'll just give us some insight into the thoughts of the people who are joining on this call this morning. So the next question is, what is the best characteristic of a successful leader? So if you could just pick one, just to get a kind of a trend of, so is it the ability to delegate, communication, influence, respect, or decision maker? So we could just select what you feel is the most important characteristic of a successful leader. And I might then turn to John to see what his thoughts are, just as we're bringing up the answers there on that. We'll just give it a couple of seconds now. Okay, Barbara, is that? Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, so a third of you have felt that communication is one of the best characteristics. That would be the majority of people. The second one there is influence and respect come in joint second, that they're important. With lower down the scale being decision-making and ability to delegate. So they're the 5 traits that we've selected. Of those, John, the top one is communication. I suppose, what's your view of what are the best traits you like to see in a successful leader? And do you agree with some of those findings?
I do, yeah, Eoin. Well, I mean, it's kind of all of the above, but I think the more senior you become in an organization, the more communication and influence become important. Because if you think about someone starting off in a kind of a management role, the first thing you got to do is learn to manage yourself. And then you move on to managing others, and then managing managers, and then probably managing functions. And then when you get up to enterprise management in a group, there are a lot more audiences, there's a lot more complication, there's a lot more balance to be struck in the decisions that are taken, and therefore communication and influencing constituencies becomes much more important, particularly at that level. And I don't think you can ever lose sight of the fact too, though, that decision making sits there too. Someone has to call it at the end of the day. And you know, even in these COVID times, we've had a lot of debate about pursuit of perfection sometimes being the enemy of good or what's right, and decision-making uncertainty. You'll never have all the answers, because there'll be no reward for risk if everything could be determined in advance. And there's a point at which you have to make the decision, balance the risk, communicate where we're going, and try and influence those who are part of the organization, the movement, or whatever.
One part of it is, and it comes up a number of times, you know, define the difference between leadership and management. And maybe, you know, that part of that question where delegation was lower down in that question there, is that because delegation is seen as more a managerial skill set rather than maybe a leadership skill?
I think so, yeah, because I think as particularly, you know, in a very, you know, getting stuff done to other people, managing a group of managers, there's a balance between delegation building a team, testing people with projects and work streams, to as a leadership role is more senior, then there are bigger debates to be had, more calls to be made about the balance between internal and external. And that's changing over time too, Eoin, because the nature of the workforces are evolving. There's a whole concept today of purposeful leadership. What's the purpose of this business or undertaking? And do people want to work there? And therefore communicating that rather than just telling this is what you're going to do and being authoritative and directive probably is less effective. So if I wanted to summarize it, it's probably more about, collaboration and a collaborative approach.
And why are we changing, I suppose, to that purpose? Is that because of younger people? They want more from a job, or it's not just a job? Is it that they want more from their career? They want to feel part of an organization? And is that trend going to continue?
Yeah, I think it's a wider societal piece that, there's much more debate going on about the world we're living in and what kind of world we want to live in. And the role of business in society is being debated and argued. And you could argue that in COVID, with the production of a vaccine in 10 months, we're seeing the very best of business and enterprise with state support to harness the resources of large companies to produce a result like has been produced in the shortest time ever in history using revolutionary technology. And it's about young people wanting to see wanting to do something meaningful, and therefore purpose has become much more important. It's like the whole rise of ESG investing, environment, social governance. What are the impacts of businesses on sustainability of the planet, on society into the future? And therefore people want to increasingly, and as the generational change happens, people want to feel part of that.
Yeah, and we'll come to sustainability and industry leadership later in the conversation. I'm very conscious, you've obviously worked a career in leading and at the top helm of many organizations, pre-Glanbia, post-Glanbia, and within Glanbia itself. I suppose you've met many leaders throughout that career, externally and internally. What ones would have made an impact on you, or what type of people would have made an impact on you, and what do you think made them so great, I suppose? So, is there that one person, that one leader around the world today that you would admire or look up to?
Like I'm not sure I ever had, someone I want to be like that person, because I think it's important to be yourself, Eoin, as well. I think it's important to be authentic. So some of the great people are authentic, and a characteristic I like too is kind of humble. I like the whole concept of servant leadership, that you're not there, that the organization sits at the behest of the CEO, but the CEO is a servant of the organization and is a custodian of an office at a point in time, and is judged on how well you move the organization forward and improve its position. Any organization, a voluntary, commercial, or otherwise. But clearly there have been people, in Agri, you can't overlook the three men in the caravan down in Kerry, the Dennis Brosnan, Dennis Cregan, and Hugh Freed, with a vision, a dreamer, and an operations guy who created something out of nothing. People who took fledgling ideas and built them into something significant. The Steve Jobs at a multinational level, and the advent of portable smartphone with all the features and the way that was organized in terms of design and a global supply chain.
And you talk about, you mentioned two tech entrepreneurs there. What do you think in general then, if you were to call one or two aspects or traits that they would have across those leaders that you've just mentioned, what's the one trait that makes them, that would make them stand out for you?
Probably just articulating a vision for application of a technology and what it can do in society, and being able to discern that, and then building on the back of that a whole commercial and supply chain organization of global scale. You know, some of that's extraordinary if you think about the pace and speed of development.
Because it's, I suppose, one thing having an idea, it's the execution of that and bringing the people and turning that idea
Absolutely.
into a company. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that's
absolutely
what those guys down in Kerry probably effectively have done over generations. You know, and that brings us maybe a little bit towards, you know, obviously not all leaders are great, and many leaders make mistakes, and many companies put in place leaders who don't, you know, may not work out. You know, I suppose, where's your head at with that situation? You know, so a company may have made a decision around a leader. Have you ever experienced it, I suppose, firsthand? And what should someone or a company do, or a leader do, if they find they've put someone into a position that may not fit that position?
Well, I think leadership, you know, there's an old saying, the fish rots from the head down, you know. If leadership becomes self-focused and ego-driven, and then it's a short step from that maybe to arrogance. And in a fast-moving world, I think that's a recipe for disaster, because you will miss things. So I come back to the notion of being open to feedback, being open to challenge, being open to taking input and advice. But at the end of the day, somebody has to call it. And where that happens, I think that's you know, a very bad day for organizations, and can take a while to recover. And that happens too. And you know, you have difficult, you know, I've made that mistake myself, where someone was appointed to a senior role, and 10 months, a year in, you realize, with all due respect to a long relationship with an individual, this isn't going to work, and it's not the right thing for the organization. And therefore, in everybody's interests, the person as well as the organization, you're better to take the decision and make a change and move on. Deal with someone honorably and appropriately, but you've got to move on, because the longer you leave it, the more the organization and a wider team around that person will struggle and will suffer.
I think, just to pick up on one point you made just earlier, it's, you know, how do you keep your feet on the ground, avoiding becoming egotistical, arrogant, you know, that you know, because as you move up through large organizations, you know, you become more removed probably from your from the ground, from your customers. You know, how do you keep your feet in the ground?
I think it's important to keep links down the organization. You should never lose the ability to pick up the phone to a few people you would trust to give you straight feedback about what's happening at different levels down an organization. You can never not go out and walk the ground enough. And there's two aspects to that. You can never underestimate the importance of people from head office being seen to go out and meet people on the ground, walk sites, walk factories. Even today, as I encourage board members in the businesses I'm involved in to go out and get down into the factories. How can you assess? You can't assess culture or the way things are done from a head office. Ultimately, you've got to go down and sense it and feel it and touch it a bit.
I know there'll be a lot of people on the call today who are managers of people, divisions, units of business. Getting that balance of between walking onto the floor as the boss and gaining, I suppose, the respect to do that, while not being seen to remove delegation and to be seen as too controlling. How do you get that balance?
Well, I think there's a bit of style in it. I think it can't be. I was never into the state visit kind of mentality. You know, you go down to see how people are doing. What are the issues? What are the problems? What has been done well done? What can be done to help to improve things? And there's support and challenge in that as well. It isn't, you know, it isn't kind of soft stuff. I think I always like, even at this stage, if you're visiting as a non-executive director, to have a little bit of the business review going on. Where are we? What are we doing? Where are the development opportunities? How are we going to grow this particular part of the business that you're in?
Yeah. leaders, and it came up in our poll, leaders must make, the ability to make tough decisions. I suppose going back over your career, was there ever a time you had to make a tough decision? And I suppose, how did you deal with that? And maybe what did you learn from it? I think
tough decisions. Well, I suppose I talked about one earlier, which was just having to take, to make senior changes where it wasn't going to work out. But I mean, back in I've had to do difficult things, and I suppose the one that stands out was probably the first time I'd never done anything like it before, when Avonmore and Waterford came together in 1997, a good while ago for some people on this call, but that was the largest corporate combination in Irish corporate history at that time. And then we were involved in developing an integration plan, and I was involved in the milk processing side of the business at that stage in Ireland. So developing that, the answer that came out of that is that we were going to close the principal Waterford site in Dungarvan over a 2-year period and move the equipment to Ballyraggett and Kilkenny. And getting to that point was months and months of analysis and decision making. But at the end of the day, then somebody had to go and stand up in the canteen, had to go and talk to the managers of a number of factories, and to then get that done. And for some wise person decided I should do it. I'd never done anything like that in my life before, in my career to that point. Met the management teams in the morning. It was very difficult. People with settled families, careers, you were delivering uncertainty. Now, we'd done a lot of communication, and we'd already did a lot of supports for people. And then stood up in the canteen and said the plan was we were going to shut the site, and we were going to seek to move elements of equipment over a 2-year period. That was the most difficult day I think I ever put in. I was emotionally and physically drained at the end of it. But I suppose I had I prepared as well as I could. Sometimes I'm facing into a difficult meeting like that, I will get away from people and I'll role play it out in my head beforehand, the Q&A, the whole piece, as best I can, and prepare that way. And ultimately, it was successful. I mean, it was it wasn't a bad time in Ireland to making big organizational change. The late 90s, early 80s, the economy was on the up, put a lot of supports, put a lot of around people getting alternative employment, negotiated a reasonable deal with the trade unions, put a lot of supports into retraining for people, set up a little investment fund to support some new businesses starting up in a number of the affected areas in Dublin and Dungarvan and so on. And to the extent that that was helpful, it was fine, but you ultimately for a period impacted pretty deeply on people's lives. You're lacking in any emotional intelligence if you don't feel a sense of that, and it's helpful to feel a sense of that because it probably enables you to do it with a bit of, you've got to do it with real empathy and feeling, but at the end of the day, this is the right thing for the business and to sustain it over the longer term. I just wonder today, but there's a shopping centre now where that site was. The town reinvented itself, and you wonder how a business could have sustained there much longer. Anyway, in the middle of an urban setting, when the plant was first built, it was a much smaller town.
And I think that's really interesting insights. I think, you talk about evolution of businesses through that, I think. And while those decisions, and they're difficult decisions, every leader, every manager faces those things. But going back to an earlier point that you made about serving the company and what's in the best interest of the company, I think seems to be, that needs to be first and foremost as the caretaker of that business during a tenure as a business leader or a business owner.
Yeah, absolutely, Eoin, because if you're going to set out to do a difficult transformation or to promote a particular, a new construct of a business or whatever, and no doubt you will have varying opinions and you would potentially have opposition to a particular approach, as I've experienced over the years. It's pretty crucial, first of all, that you're 100% convinced, this is, having talked to the people you need to talk to, that this is the right thing to do. And really happy within yourself that this is the reasons why it's the right thing to do. Because if you don't have that level of belief and clarity of that, how are you going to convince anybody else?
Yeah, very, very true. And yeah, and just making sure that you have that empathy and connection with the people, that it's affecting people's lives as well. Not to lose that, I think, was a key point that I've taken from that. I see a number of questions coming in. If you just to remind you, if you do want to ask any questions, just use the facility on the screen, and I'll come to them shortly. I want to just take a little bit of a step back from maybe leadership and move into more the business and business strategic thinking. And I think, you know, we're all familiar, and everyone would know and feels that they should, if they're in a business leadership position or they're managing a business unit, that they should have a 3 or 5 year strategy of this perfect journey of how their companies or their businesses are going to be mapped out into the future. Did you have this at Glanbia? And did it all go as planned during your tenure as CEO? Or was it all a little bit different? It'd be great to get insights on that, John.
I think strategy is often, sometimes, if people are honest, is often better looking backwards, you know, which is a contradiction in terms. But I think I kind of believe in the evolution of strategy. And I think it's about getting yourself, first you've got to get yourself, we had a phrase way back when we had difficult days back in the early 2000s, we had to earn the right to grow. We couldn't borrow any more money. We needed to reshape, restructure, and earn the right to grow, have the capacity to do it from our own resources of people, of capital, of technology. And in terms of evolving a strategy, then I am a believer in kind of building staircases. And when you get up on a step, you see things differently than you did on the step you were below it. And there's a book on staircases to growth that I'm kind of a fan of, which is, you know, Horizon 1, you extend and defend the core business you have. Horizon 2, you make some small investments in step outs, and then you might make a couple of bets out in Horizon 3, which are businesses that might develop into something, but you have capacity to take a bit more risk on smaller bets for something that may become much more relevant in 5 to 7 years' time. And having a plan is one thing. You know, I've often used the phrase that Eisenhower used to use as the leader of the invasion of Europe in 1944, was that plans are nothing, planning is everything. I'm a believer in the plan will change. You know, as Tyson said, everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the face. So the planning process and an annual planning cycle of a rolling 3 or 5 year plan, whatever is appropriate for the business, is more important in getting managers to think about where's the world now and where are we and what opportunities and threats are out there and how do we respond to them and keep that rolling piece going. And when then difficult things happen up to and including a pandemic, people have thought about how their business might respond, have already done a bit of thinking and can make changes fast if they're set up to be reasonably agile. So it's that whole planning process that throws up the opportunities. And be able to say it to business units, everybody once a year is an opportunity to say, look, I've got a big idea for how we could improve the business, you know.
And I think this brings in my next question somewhat, in that, you know, if you look at the companies that you've worked in and work in today, you know, they range in structure from family-owned companies such as ABP to state, semi-state companies such as Quilcha, to the PLCs of the Glanbias, DCC, Smurfit, and Greencore. Do the PLC structures, right, who are very rigid maybe in the reporting and need to be from an investment and stockholder point of view, do they need to define their strategy tighter, right, because of that, and that allows the family-owned companies maybe to be more flexible, or do you see them more combined in their strategy planning?
Yeah, no, I mean, the planning and thinking about the future, I think, is important for every business. I think, you know, PLCs have a particular, you know, they are projecting and do a level of projection into the future about, you know, what do they expect earnings to be, and linking that to the positions they have in markets and articulating, you know, to put the technical term, what's the warranted value of future cash flows that ultimately can feed into a value of a share price, And then, but you're not trying to manage a portfolio for people. You're putting forward a proposition that says we have positions in a particular market, we have a set of capacities and capabilities, and we have a view that these are sustainable over time, and therefore there's a value creation play. But there are obviously in privately held companies, the same things apply, but maybe decision-making cycles can be different and you're closer to the shareholder. But shareholder communications and what are the shareholder expectations are kind of important. I mean, even at a level when I was chairman of Creature, we went through a lot of change. And one of the big evolutions was getting a shareholder expectation letter from the state, from the two relevant departments of public expenditure and reform, and agriculture as the lead department. And therefore the board set out to execute against that. And then you get down to management styles and management approaches within the business to execute on that strategy. And in Creature, in the 5 years, we went from a very centralized head office led to pushing down responsibility to 3 strategic business units, going to a very lean center. And that enabled people to grow and develop. And you saw who the leaders were that were stepping up in 3 empowered business units. And I think that was a really interesting time to be engaged in that and see what happened, you know.
And I suppose that then leads to, you know, do you need a different type of leadership style in a PLC versus a semi-state versus a family business, you know?
Well, there are differences maybe in the communication with different stakeholders, which is the managing, you know, to the shareholder base. But at the end of the day, the principles of good management and leadership within running the business, the objective is to operate the business to its potential, and to do that in the context of being a responsible business in a wider societal context. So after that, the planning, the operations, the routines, the weekly, monthly reporting, the strategic planning sessions in terms of thinking about the future are all the same. There are structural issues then that come in, of course, after strategy. And I kind of believe, and I see the power of it in COVID, having devolved and empowered businesses where the management feel are accountable, but also have a sense of responsibility and ideally a sense of ownership of their particular part of the business. I think that's pretty powerful, you know.
Yeah, so important of allowing the business unit managers to do their own thing. And I think, again, I'm thinking about influencing here as a leader, that you have to influence people below you that you're managing, but also you may need to influence people around your board, and trying to get that, I suppose, that skill set. You know, is there any advice you would have to try ensure that you're able, that ability to influence?
Well, I think around a board, I think a board in any organization need to really understand the strategy, and they need to understand the nature of the business, and they need to get out and around the business to understand, you know, the way it works. How intense is it? How it's set up? Because then it's easier to have the debate around the board table about how you're going to do things in the future. And then similarly from the organizational structure and what are the routines, the disciplines. Because even when you mention that people are empowered and manager to get on with it, it is also that they get on with it in a framework then that is set from the top and a tone from the top about everything from ethics to supply chain integrity to diversity policies, to recruitment policies. But within that, people have a freedom to operate. It's not that they do their own thing irrespective, but every organization has to have a core set of policies that go to its values and ensure, despite a devolved approach, which gives management operating flexibility and ability to respond to the marketplace within an appropriate framework.
So you're kind of touching off an area that comes up quite a lot in leadership and business strategy is culture eats strategy for breakfast. Do you agree with that statement that culture is really, really important across an organization, and that the leader needs to embody it and live it every day?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because if you can have all the plans in the world, you know, and a great plan will die on the altar of implementation. And how do you get something implemented? It's how it gets done down through the organization. The organization doesn't agree with it, has a different way of working, has a way of working or a setup that is not going to enable the plan to be achieved, well, then you're dead in the water. So if it's not receptive to it, and that brings you back then to the point of, you know, what has become more mainstream now, purpose. What are we about here? Why are we going to do this? Communication. What are the benefits? Because people bring that down to an organizational benefit, and very quickly it gets to, how is this going to affect me, you know?
I just see a question there around failure, I suppose. It's from Niamh Brambrick. Is there a big blunder or mess up that you feel you've got wrong during your career? Now, and maybe as you think about that, I suppose it's nearly understanding, how do you cope with failure as well, and how should you embrace it and move on from it?
Yeah, I can't remember anything like. I got a very major project to re-engineer the chills in Meadow Meats when I was 22, and I measured it wrongly and I didn't put in enough, so I got into a lot of trouble over that. But I think there are things that might have been, you know, been done better in terms of getting things done faster, and they were more not putting enough time into the communication, not ensuring that people understood where we were going and why we were doing it. But I think it's important that in organizations, there's a sense of that it's safe to try new things, as opposed to, if you fail, you're doomed forever. Now, I think we're not into the concept of supporting ongoing heroic failure, because it's not going to get anybody anywhere, but that it's safe to try new things, because I think with the pace of technology, the pace of change today, organizations who aren't innovating, you know, across business process, business model, product process, or business model, are going to struggle. And therefore, we need people to be thinking innovatively about how things are done, about new products, new services, application of technology all the time. So creating a culture where it's safe for people to do that is really important, and to reward and celebrate it. And we're bad at this side of the Atlantic on doing that. But it's got to be thought out properly, and people to approach it in a commercial fashion, not the concept of a bit slapdash, and then you're just going nowhere.
So you're possibly touching off, you know, challenging some thoughts within an organization, being able to have them in a speak up environment, or a comfortable environment where people can challenge, and driving that throughout an organization, rather than maybe individuals taking heroic pieces along on their own.
Just making the concept of innovation a key part of what people do, you know, and people think innovation isn't just about new products. It's about the way we go to market. It's about the business model, different approaches, and technology is driving that and enabling it today. And not to be, you know, think about the pace of digitization that's going to go on now in businesses post-COVID. Look what we're doing this morning, you know. So adapting to all that, and encouraging people to think about how best to adapt that in their business or organization is crucial.
Okay. I'm going to move on then, just to talk about, we've about 10 minutes left, the industry and maybe the future of the sector and the challenges ahead. And I suppose if I look at it, where we've come from in the last 5 years, and I know you sat and chaired the committee that was responsible for the government strategy Foodwise 2025, which a big part of it was expansion, growth, you know, and we've seen that since lifting of dairy quotas. But I suppose the question I have is that, and again, you know, conscious it's an ASA audience, you know, as an industry, are we showing enough leadership around reconciling the sector post-quota growth and our ambition around that with the government and the state's climate commitments? And maybe aligned to that, you know, are we showing that leadership, maybe aligned to that? Are we losing the battle with industry and the public a little bit where farming is seen as bad?
Yeah, that's a big question. Now we could go on for the rest of the day on that. I mean, like in the Foodwise report, the obvious thing that was going to happen at the end of the day, that dairy in Ireland was going to do a big catch up in the liberation of quotas, because, you know, basic simple fact, we have a comparative advantage here of a grass-based production system that had been constrained, and with the changes in the common agricultural policy that had happened prior to that, then the obvious route to enhance productivity, farm profitability, and so on, was to drive expansion. And that has happened significantly. And it has captured and created a lot of value across a significant natural advantage that Ireland had. In the next phase now, post COP21 and the Paris Accord, and moving on to Edinburgh next year, and the whole, particularly in Europe, focus on climate, sustainability, ESG investing, all parts of the same piece of a wider societal responsibility for all undertakings and how society knits together, I think raises a very significant challenge and also opportunity. And the thing is not to be overcome by what we see as the challenges, but to think about how we can turn it to the advantage, particularly in Ireland, of a grass-based system. But we've got to get more clear about going from soil to sward. Looking at, best example I have is what I've seen happen at the Devonish farm at the Nouth in Meath, taking a permanent pasture farm, applying modern technologies, and driving very significant product, more output for less input. So to take that on then, that has to be articulated, I think, much more clearly. The potential for technology to be deployed, for everything to get clearer and more uniformly accepted measures of sustainability. Because make no mistake about it, this is going to happen, and it's going to be pushed back up the supply chain from consumers through retailers, and you can see many large corporates across the world increasingly declaring carbon progress targets by 2020, carbon neutral targets by 2050. So in a decarbonizing economy, articulating the efforts and progress that has been made in the agri-food sector to date, and what more can be done using technologies, and not allowing the regulator to drag us there, but also to move forward as well.
That's a key point, John. I was just going to ask you that. Is that the job of the regulator, right? Or do individual companies and business people and leaders of the industry and people who are on this call, is it our collective responsibility to drive that agenda?
I think it's better that it be a collective responsibility to drive that agenda, because if it's regulated, then it has, I think the danger is it could be more oppressive. I think it's a better case for the industry to be really proactive and open and having across the supply chain dialogue, because otherwise this is going to push at us, not just from regulators, but from consumers and from retailers. And there's a lot of good stuff. I am familiar with the meat business as the world's only carbon neutral abattoir in the UK.
Are you, I suppose, are you worried about the future of the carbon footprint impact of Irish agriculture, or do you think we can overcome it?
I think we have to put it in context, and what is not said is the reason agriculture is a high percent. We didn't have an industrial revolution here. We've had the tech and pharma revolution since, driven by foreign direct investment. But by definition, agriculture has a high footprint here because of that. But it's not out as compared to other countries where they've had coal burning sectors and so on. But the reality is that we have a sustainable model. We just need to demonstrate that by getting a common set of measures that are agreed, clearing up the debate around methane, using technology and technology across the full supply chain, from whether it's new feed additives that will emerge, and I believe are emerging to address methane issue and improve feed efficiency, all the way to soil to sward management approaches, clover, nitrogen, all of that, all the way up to through plants and out onto a consumer shelf, plastic being replaced in packaging. That's all coming back at us anyway, going to paper-based systems on the packaging side. So it challenges all, but with the right pacing and the industry being as united as possible, rather than one branch saying, well, you need to do that and you need to get on with it. More unification is what's helpful. And then having some clear articulation and strong articulation about what the industry has done and what it can do and will do.
And it sounds like it's a lot of, if everybody is talking to this and every company is doing a little bit, it will help move the country towards a more sustainable future. I think that seems to be what I'm...
Yeah, but I think that die is cast. That's where the world and that's where Europe is going in particular.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose we couldn't let the week go. You know, this is a crucial day probably the most crucial day for Brexit talks since the last 4 years. Where's your head at on Brexit? Do you feel Brexit will happen? Will there be a deal? And you know, how do we learn to live with whatever future lies ahead of us?
Yeah, I look, I don't know what today and tomorrow will bring, but we're in the end game of the end game, as I just read somewhere this morning. And no matter what happens, there's going to be huge change now anyway. There are going to be, what's at issue is whether there are going to be tariffs or not, depending on the outcome. But we're still, if there is agreement, we're going to have significant non-tariff barriers. The movement of product through the UK and the land bridge and directly will be affected by significant regulatory change and a lot more form filling. The big issue, though, is from Ireland's point of view in the agri-food sector, is if there is a deal, and therefore if there is the lack of tariff barriers, if there isn't a deal, then we face a really challenging piece over the next number of years. There'll be dislocation of product. There will be, and that's my concern, because across dairy and beef, we have proximity. On the other hand, Irish produce is understood, well regarded, long established in the UK's nearest supplier to a country that is deficit. But the reality of a WTO regime is a 55 to 70% tariff on beef, and that market more competitive with cheaper supply sources. The same applies to dairy. So the Ornu are quoting 100 million impact on their exports to the UK in the past week. So whether the issues of slogans and around sovereignty are reconciled in the context of a level playing field and in things like fisheries and control of the seas. And it would seem to me to be a terrible pity that a 650 million market, which is the UK's fish catch in UK waters, and the difference between whether it's 50% of that or 18% of that or whatever is a couple of 100 million, has an impact that is multiples of that.
Do you think they're showing good leadership?
Leadership in the world of politics, as we know from the US and elsewhere, has become a very complex and somewhat riven by dark arts. And I think that's a concern, and that's something we should all be concerned about.
Yeah, fair enough. Before we just go into the last section on the future and that, maybe just to touch on COVID as well. I think had it not been for COVID, we probably never would have had Zoom. I think it's been quite positive in terms of facilitating sessions such as this. It's quite efficient. What do you think the legacy, though, of COVID will be? I
think for businesses, the pace of digitization will have to ramp up significantly. If you're not doing it, you must be doing it. More direct, more interwoven relationships with suppliers, with customers, consumers that are digitally based, direct to consumer models. And there'll be efficiencies come out of that through the supply chain. I think it has demonstrated the ability of resilient businesses. How do you build resilience? You know, and people investing as well to support resilience. You know, great debates for over many years about the just in time, but now maybe people are investing about just in case.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how again, those models have changed maybe in the last couple of years, that just in time was the panacea of business operations 10, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. What about ag tech and innovation? How do you see that? Do you see COVID accelerating innovation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's all part, and I think it's all part of the sustainability answer is the use of technology. And I include technology as it applies to soil management, fertilizer application, animal husbandry, supply chain, automation across right to the consumer. And I think that all that has the potential to be advanced and to be embraced once it's sensible, you know.
Okay, just a couple of other questions. Just on that book recommendation, John, was it Staircases to Growth?
Yeah.
There's a number of people asking about that. If there is any other questions, if you just want to forward them on at this stage.
And the leadership pipeline is another interesting one about just development. The leadership pipeline.
Leadership pipeline. Okay, that's great. And then if there's any other questions, just keep them coming in to us here.
Sorry, the first one is it's the alchemy of growth. The staircase piece comes into it. The alchemy of growth.
Alchemy of growth. Okay, great. Thanks, John. Okay, just around maybe I suppose the advice going forward, and for a number of people, I suppose, given where you've outlined where your career has come from, what you've succeeded in life, I assume a number of people come to you looking for advice. I suppose, what's your go-to piece for when these people come to you for guidance?
Well, that's a big question. Look, I never saw myself ending up where I've ended up, right? There's a couple of lessons maybe. You probably, you need to build up a bit of resilience. Meadow Meats was fine till it burned down, I had to start again. But everything, you build up resilience, you build up experience. I probably think embracing change is a good thing. So I found myself being a bit restless, what's the next job? What's the next role? And is that ambition? Maybe it is. Maybe it's a low boredom threshold. Maybe it's insecurity or something. But being open to change, and also it's also that people have to take a chance on you, and therefore you have to take a chance on people sometimes as well. And people shouldn't forget that, it cuts both ways.
Yeah, I suppose, if we look at your career, the majority of us spent with one organization. That's somewhat different to a lot of the younger generation, and especially some of the ASA members whom I'm sure are listening today. The world is changing, I suppose, and that job for life is changing. I suppose, have you any thoughts around that, and knowing when to maybe commit to a company and knowing when to be able to move from a company?
Well, I think that the bedrock of it is building up all the time, building up skills and experiences, and then seeing what opportunities that opened up. I'm a believer, Eoin, in lifelong learning. Every day you've got to be thinking about, what are you going to learn today? I've done lots of different programs in project management. Even as an MD, I went off in 2 years in and did an advanced management program at the University of Navarre in Barcelona. not for what you get, but from the people you meet and the other experiences you get. And the day you stop learning is the day you kind of have to pack it in, I think. So it's building up experiences and learning, and then seeing where you can apply those to best effect. And they may not be possible to do that in the organization you're currently in, and they may be valued more greatly elsewhere.
I see a question in here from Eilish Byrne. What has motivated you over the years to continue your career progression?
I'd say probably just being, part of it was that people took a chance on me, but basic thing, whatever the role was, do it. This sounds trite maybe and a bit old school, but doing it to the best I could. And then I'd get restless and want to see what was the next thing I could do, and adding in some new learnings, a few new skills all the time as I went along.
Yeah,
and that just keeps building up then. And the reality is, if things happen, they happen then, and make the best of it.
I want to switch tact a little bit. We're just coming up to the end of the conversation, and I know a number of years ago we met, and you were telling me at the time that you were going off to do the Camino, and I think it was with your two sons. I suppose it's something that, you know, for those of you not familiar with the Camino is a walk across northern Spain. I think it's something like 800 kilometers long in totality, but I'd like to understand, it's bringing in a little bit, John, around that, getting that work-life balance, I suppose. And I'd like to understand your motivations for doing something such as the Camino, something as rudimentary as just walking. Why did you do it, first of all? And maybe what did you learn from doing it? And why are these things important in life?
Well, I think like I might be the best example, because I spent 60% of my time away from home for probably 20 years. Joan, my wife, says she's seen more of me in the last 30 weeks than she did in the last 30 years, but we're still fine. Like, I think it's important to get the balance right. And I think younger people get that more than I did. And because you don't get that time back. And probably there's a balance between working to live and living to work. And I think some people have that balance better now than I had. But the Camino piece then was just, when I turned 60, there were two important things about that. My two sons gave me the gift of time. So the three of us went off and walked the last 150 kilometers. And there was the simpleness of it, the camaraderie along the trail. And it was, you often hear people say it's often better to travel than to arrive. But in the case of the Camino, it was great to travel, and it was also fantastic to arrive. So it's important to kind of do stuff like that, make time, because you're building, in work you build experiences, but it's also important, this is a life stage, a life journey, and you need to build good memories. You don't want to reflect and say, there's probably nobody on their deathbed who said, I wished I'd worked a day more, you know?
Yeah, absolutely, I'd say. Very, very interesting point, you know, to travel rather than to arrive. Is it the same in business? You know, is the journey more exciting than getting to the place, the end?
Yeah, yeah, it's a journey. The destination can continue to evolve. And it's how you go on the journey that probably makes the difference. And probably that's the essence of leadership, that you make a difference in a positive sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, John, I think we'll leave it at that. And I'm going to hand it back to Anne-Marie in a moment. I think, look, first and foremost, thanks very much for outlining your insights, your thoughts, around leadership style, around the future direction of the industry, the challenges, the opportunities ahead. I think overall what I've taken from it, you know, you've touched on that authentic leader, the servant leader. I think they're kind of key attributes of leadership that maybe are not so well known. We've talked about the importance of delegation, not losing sight of or not becoming too egotistical or an arrogant leader. And having a little bit of a style about you when you're out on the floor or out meeting people, and making sure that you have empathy. But I think as well is that, look, I've very clear in your articulation of it is the communication of leadership is critically important. I think that kind of resonates with what many on the call have been saying this morning as well. Look, unfortunately, we couldn't do this in person, but I think we've had a very interesting conversation. So thanks very much for joining us this morning, John. I'm going to hand back to Anne-Marie now.
Thanks, Eoin.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you sincerely to John and to Eoin. I think there's plenty of food for thought in there, plenty of advice for us all. I think John certainly brought us on a journey, or a good travel, John, from Dungarvan to the Camino and back. I suppose it would be remiss of me not to wish everyone in Waterford the very best of luck in the coming weeks. So the best of luck for that, and certainly there'll be a lot of leadership shown on the day from both teams there. I would just sincerely also like to thank Eoin Lowry. Eoin, it's always a pleasure to work with Eoin, and today was no different, and I'd like to thank him for bringing us on a very insightful leadership as well as many other empathy parts onto it, Eoin. So thank you very much. Look, from the ASA, again, we would just like to thank so many of you for joining this morning in such large numbers. As always, we welcome all feedback from our members and non-members. So please do get in touch with Barbara in the office or myself, president@asaireland.ie. We're always open to feedback, and we love to hear how you're enjoying the experience. I suppose one final one from us, as you're aware, the ASA have recently launched a new fellowship program in association with FBD. And I suppose we are looking for a leader. We're looking for somebody who's energetic and ambitious, with a very strong science foundation, but wants to bring their science and learning a little bit further, and to become an advocate, not just for ASA, but for the agri-industry, and to represent us both nationally and internationally. So if you are interested, and I encourage everyone to take the time to visit the ASA website and just see the information that's needed there for the fellowship, or pop us a phone call, and we're very happy to discuss. So as it is the 8th of December, I'd like to wish everybody a very happy Christmas. Hope Santa Claus is good to all of those, and from everyone at ASA, have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.